My father's family actually first resided in Washington before the Civil War. They were German Jewish immigrants who came in and started a shoe store downtown that would ultimately blossom in a business that would last from the late 1860s to the 1980s.
My father was an immigrant to this country. He came in 1928. And we often teased him that he didn't have anything to lose in the Depression, so he was fine. He started as a fuller brush man. And then when the Depression hit, he was peddling neckties in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And he was told the only one who was buying were hairdressers. And they told him, well, you should get into this business. And my father had an artistic flair, so he did. And then he opened a beauty school. And from the beauty school, he started bringing more and more Sephardi into the area, and that's why you find so many Sephardi in the beauty business in Washington, because they came in through these education permits my father was able to obtain through the school and bring them here and started them off in business.
We did not have a kosher home, but my mother lit candles every Friday night. And my paternal grandparents were alive in my growing up years. So the entire family on my father's side gathered for Seder's and at Hanukkah to collect Hanukkah gelt. I went to religious school. I had a taste of Orthodox reform and ended up in a conservative shul.
With my German Jewish grandparents, they were so used to being this sort of disguised minority that they seemed often more Gentile than the Gentiles. And my grandmother, Rich, I still remember whenever she could never say the word Jew. If she was talking about someone who might be Jewish at the dinner table, she'd say, I think he may be a member of our tribe. And she'd say it in this sort of sotto voce, as if someone might come, the police might come in or something.
Well, my grandfather worked in his father's store. My great-grandfather, who I never knew, but worked in his store right down here in the 6th Street corridor and had a hardware store catering to the building trades, but not actually in the building trades. And as he tells me the story, having to be up at 5:30 in the morning to meet the building trades and to supply them was tiresome. He said, there's got to be an easier way than to be at work every day at 6 o'clock in the morning downtown. I'm going to get into the real estate brokerage, the mortgage business, and he ended up with being in both of those industries and allowing himself not to be the first guy to work in the morning.
Washington was a very Gentile city, and indeed it was famously known that Garfinkel's for years would not have Jewish employees, that there were neighborhoods both in Washington, upper middle class neighborhoods both in Washington and in the Maryland suburbs that had restrictive covenants against Jews. Washington was a sleepy, southern, segregated, even if officially desegregated city that was very dull and very kind of monochromatic, largely because of black people were on the other side of the park, and it really was segregated. It was like living on a big plantation to some extent.
My grandfather, primarily commercial developer, my father, primarily an apartment and commercial developer. I focused on the pure residential home building side and actually gravitated to Northern Virginia. People used to joke, Sonny, you're going over to Virginia, there are no Jewish people over there. We don't even know where the bridge is to cross the river to get there. How did you find that to begin with, let alone make a career out of that environment? And what's been fascinating to see in Northern Virginia is, which was very true when I started there over 20 years ago, the Jewish population was actually quite small. It has grown enormously.
My mother and father counseled, helped get people started, gave them the means to get started. I mean, they truly were just a Sephardic Jessup in Washington, and our door was always open for people who came, had no place to go. They would stay with us until they could get established. I can't remember rather, a time growing up when we didn't have someone in our home who needed a place before they set out in the world here in the United States. I mean, we had in one bedroom, we had 4 beds. You couldn't walk between them. It was wall-to-wall beds where people were sleeping because that's how they got started. It was this caring for each other. It was a concern for helping others. And, you know, the real idea of tikkun olam, one person at a time.
I don't think that there will ever be a, quote, Jewish seat again. But do I think that there will be many Jews on the federal bench? Of course. Because Jews tend to be attracted to the law. They do well in law school. They do well in their lawyering jobs, but they also have, most of them have, a sense of the importance of doing more than a day's work for a day's pay, doing more than serving a client, giving back to the community, contributing to the health and welfare of the places where they live, their local communities, their states, their nation, their world.
I grew up in Washington as a stage-struck kid in a city that was a company town of government. And you know, among my earliest memories, for instance, are watching the Kennedy inaugural parade. I absolutely think had an enormous influence on me to this day, because my whole career really has been about culture and politics and where they meet, and culture and news and history and where they meet. And I do think that there's a Jewish element to it too, because even in the small Jewish community that I grew up in Washington, there was always a cultural element that was often, in those days, more assertive than the general culture of pre-Kennedy Center Washington. For instance, I remember how vividly my mother, as a young housewife in the 50s, going to the National Council of Jewish Women and taking oil painting classes that were taught by, they weren't famous then, but they were taught by Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan. And that, you know, and that, there was always that kind of thing going on that I think made a difference.
The Washington Jewish community is a very interesting community. It is a community that essentially started as transplants for the majority of the community. It was mostly during the war, during the Roosevelt administrations, when a lot of Jews came into Washington for government jobs and stayed. That phenomena of coming in for government jobs has continued to this day.
What brought me to this capital city was President Jimmy Carter, who decided he was going to change the face of the U.S. judiciary, quite literally, because when he became president, there was only one woman on a federal court of appeals in the entire nation. And that was Shirley Hufstetler. President Carter made her the very first Secretary of Education, so then there were none. He was determined to change that. So by the time he left office, and he had only one term, he had appointed 11 women to courts of appeals, over 25 to federal district courts, and he set a pattern that no president abandoned.
There's a kind of serendipitous quality about Washington I like. The park is beautiful, and one thing I like about it now that wasn't true then is, while it's still in some ways quite segregated, it's much more integrated than it was, and arguably is in some ways more integrated than New York and some other bigger American cities. So I like that feeling now that it's become at least somewhat more of a city for everyone who lives there.
Well, my grandfather put together many real estate deals as a broker and providing mortgage financing for those deals. So he went out with the Charles Smiths of the day and the Cafertses of that day sort of an early gang, assembled the gang. He'd tell me the story as he put together property at K Street and Connecticut Avenue, now obviously a bustling corner, that was a dirt road when he put those corners together.
I can say we are the only community on the East Coast that is actually growing. Our community is now 215,000 Jews, which is a large growth.
I think we'd all like to think that ultimately there is a sense of vision. There's a sense of creating an opportunity that didn't exist previously.
When I was a new judge on this court, the court's wonderful clerk came to me and said, every year we get requests from Orthodox Jews to amend the certificate of membership in the court, because that certificate says, as every executive decree says, in the year of our Lord, so-and-so, and of the independence of the United States. And I thought that was an entirely reasonable request. So the first thing was to get chief judges from the courts of appeals to change that practice in the district courts, in the courts of appeals. That was very easy. I barely had to ask, and it was done. But here, it was harder because this place is very tradition-bound. And I was told by a colleague, why are you making a fuss about this? It was good enough for Brandeis. It was good enough for Frankfurt. I said, stop. It's not good enough for Ginsburg. And that certificate is now changed. People have a choice.
I was very proud, having not been bar mitzvahed, watching my two sons be bar mitzvahed in the Albert and Shirley Small Chapel at Washington Hebrew Congregation. That was a wonderful, almost indescribable experience to be watching my children partake in an experience that I hadn't partaken, but also have the connectedness to know that they were doing it in a building that my parents were involved in make happen for our synagogue.
What I picked up is a sense of community, that it's so much bigger than myself, that I was a part of it, but everyone is an important part of it, and if everyone didn't help, and if everyone didn't pitch in, then there was no community.
I would say that my hope is that the Jewish community continue to stand up for the values it believes in, some of which, of course, are right from the religion itself, for righteousness, for plurality, for live and let live, for the rights of people to practice religious freedom any way they want to.
And that's what was instilled in me by my parents, my father and my mother, is that you're there to help, and you're there to help others, and it doesn't matter what your means are. If you have more than the next person and they need help, then you help.